The ice cracked beneath Beatrice Turner's boots like a gunshot splitting the winter air, and in the single heartbeat before she plunged into the frozen river, she thought of all the warnings her father had given her about crossing the Yellowstone in January. The water hit her like 1,000 knives. Every nerve in her body screamed as the current dragged her under, her heavy wool coat becoming an anchor that pulled her down into the darkness. She kicked frantically, her lungs already burning, but the layers of skirts and petticoats twisted around her legs like iron chains. The surface seemed impossibly far away, a wavering sheet of pale light that grew dimmer with each passing second. Her fingers clawed at nothing but freezing water as the river swept her downstream, tumbling her like a rag doll caught in a storm. This was how she would die, she realized with sudden clarity. 20 years old and drowning in the Yellowstone River just outside Deer Lodge, Montana, all because she had been too stubborn to wait for the ferry. Then something solid grabbed her arm. Through the blur of icy water and fading consciousness, Beatrice saw a dark shape above her. Strong hands gripped her shoulders and hauled her upward with a force that seemed superhuman. Her head broke the surface and she gasped, choking on air and water simultaneously. The hands never let go, dragging her through the current with steady determination. She caught a glimpse of a man's face, jaw set with concentration, dark hair plastered to his forehead, before another wave of cold sent her thoughts scattering again. She did not remember reaching the shore. When awareness returned, she was lying on frozen ground, river water pouring from her mouth as someone pressed hard on her back. She coughed violently, her whole body convulsing as her lungs expelled what felt like half the Yellowstone River. The cold was worse now, somehow the January wind cutting through her soaked clothing like it was nothing at all. "Stay with me," a deep voice commanded. "Come on, stay awake." Beatrice tried to focus on the voice, using it as an anchor against the darkness that kept trying to pull her back under. Hands were working at her coat, stripping away the frozen layers with quick efficiency. She wanted to protest, to maintain some shred of modesty, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. A moment later, something warm and dry settled over her shoulders. A coat, she realized dimly. A man's coat that smelled of leather and wood smoke and horse. "There's a cabin about half a mile from here," the voice said. "Can you walk?" Beatrice managed to shake her head. She could barely feel her legs, let alone trust them to hold her weight. Without another word, the man scooped her into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. She caught a better look at him now as he started walking. He was young, maybe 25, with dark eyes that held a fierce determination. His own shirt was soaked through from the river, clinging to broad shoulders, but he moved with purpose despite what had to be the same bone-deep cold that was stealing through her body. "My horse," he said, and Beatrice realized he was talking to someone else. A magnificent black gelding stood a few yards away, reins trailing. "He spooked when I went in. Stubborn bastard, better not have run off completely." The horse whickered and trotted closer, as if offended by the suggestion. The man, still carrying Beatrice, managed to grab the reins with one hand. He swung her up into the saddle with surprising gentleness, then mounted behind her in one smooth motion. His arms came around her to grip the reins, effectively caging her against his chest. The warmth of his body at her back was the most wonderful thing she had ever felt. "Hold on," he murmured against her ear and kicked the horse into a canter. The ride passed in a blur of cold and motion. Beatrice drifted in and out of awareness, kept conscious only by the steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of the man behind her. When they finally stopped, she could barely open her eyes. She felt herself being lifted down, carried again, then the blessed relief of being indoors, away from the wind. The cabin was small and rough, clearly a line shack used by ranch hands during cattle drives, but it had 4 walls and a fireplace, and that was all that mattered. The man laid her on a narrow bunk, then moved with swift efficiency to build a fire. Within minutes, flames were crackling in the hearth, throwing blessed heat into the small space. "We need to get you out of those wet clothes," he said, not looking at her. His own clothes were dripping steadily onto the wooden floor. "I will turn my back. There are blankets in the chest by the wall." Beatrice tried to move and found her fingers were too numb to work the buttons of her dress. A small sound of frustration escaped her throat. The man glanced back, saw her struggling, and crossed to the chest. He pulled out several wool blankets, then hesitated. "I give you my word as a gentleman that I will not look at anything I should not," he said quietly. "But if we do not get you warm soon, you are going to die. Do you understand?" She managed a small nod. Her mother would have been horrified, but her mother was not here, and this man had just saved her life. Modesty seemed a small price to pay for survival. He helped her sit up, his touch impersonal and efficient as he worked the buttons of her dress free. True to his word, he kept his eyes averted, focusing on the fastenings rather than her skin. The dress came off, then the layers of petticoats, each one a sodden weight that had nearly been her death. He wrapped the first blanket around her shoulders before helping with her corset and chemise, his movements quick but careful. When she was finally wrapped in layers of dry wool, he turned away and began stripping off his own wet clothes. Beatrice huddled by the fire, watching through half-closed eyes as her rescuer peeled off his soaked shirt and trousers without any hint of self-consciousness. Even in her dazed state, she could not help but notice the lean muscle of his back, the broad set of his shoulders. He pulled on dry clothes from a pack in the corner, then hung their wet garments on a line stretched near the fireplace. "What is your name?" Beatrice managed to ask through chattering teeth. "Matthew Carter," he said, adding more wood to the fire. "I work for the Triple C Ranch about 10 miles north of here." "Beatrice Turner," she replied. "My father owns the general store in Deer Lodge." Matthew turned to look at her properly for the first time since they had reached the cabin. His eyes were brown, she realized, a deep, warm brown that seemed at odds with the harsh efficiency he had shown since pulling her from the river. There was concern in those eyes now, and something else she could not quite name. "What were you doing trying to cross the river in January?" he asked. "I was not trying to cross it," Beatrice said, feeling a flush of embarrassment that had nothing to do with the cold. "I was walking along the bank, taking the shortcut back to town. The ice looked solid. I thought I could cut across that little bend in the river and save myself a mile of walking." "That ice is never solid this time of year," Matthew said, but there was no judgment in his tone. "The current runs too fast. It freezes on top but stays moving underneath." "I know that now," Beatrice said dryly. Despite himself, Matthew's lips twitched in what might have been the start of a smile. "I suppose you do." He moved to the small stove in the corner and began preparing coffee. Beatrice watched him work, her thoughts slowly coming back into focus as warmth returned to her body. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to taking care of himself, measuring grounds and water without needing to think about it. When the coffee was brewing, filling the cabin with its rich aroma, he pulled up a 3-legged stool and sat down facing her. "You were lucky," he said seriously. "Another few seconds and the current would have taken you under the ice. I would not have been able to reach you then." "Why did you jump in?" Beatrice asked. "You could have drowned too," Matthew shrugged. "I saw you go through." "I was not going to just stand there and watch you die." "Most people would have," Beatrice said quietly. "It was a terrible risk." "Maybe," Matthew agreed, But I am a decent swimmer even in winter, and I grew up on rivers. I knew I had a chance. The coffee finished brewing, and he poured 2 tin cups, handing one to Beatrice. She wrapped her hands around it gratefully, letting the heat seep into her fingers. The first sip burned her tongue, but she did not care. It was hot and strong and exactly what she needed. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the fire crackle. Outside, the January wind howled around the cabin walls, but inside it was warm and safe. Beatrice found herself studying Matthew's face when he was not looking. He had strong features, weathered by sun and wind in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors. There was a scar along his jawline, old and faded, and his hands were calloused from years of ranch work. He was handsome, she realized with a start, in a rough, practical way that had nothing to do with the polished gentleman who came courting in town. "How long have you worked for the Triple C?" she asked, partly to distract herself from that line of thinking. 5 years, Matthew said. "Came out from Ohio after my parents died. Heard there was work out west for anyone willing to do it." "Do you like it?" "The ranch work," he considered the question. "It is hard work. Long hours, rough conditions, but I like being outdoors. I like working with horses and cattle. It is honest work, and that matters to me." "What were you doing out here today?" Beatrice asked. "This seems far from your ranch." "Checking the line shacks," Matthew explained. "Making sure they are stocked and in good repair before the real winter storms hit. This one is technically on our land, but we share it with a few of the neighboring outfits when needed." He paused. "Lucky for you, I decided to check this one today." "Lucky for me," Beatrice agreed softly. Another silence fell, but it was not uncomfortable. Beatrice felt her eyelids growing heavy as the warmth and exhaustion caught up with her. She tried to fight it, knowing it was improper to fall asleep in the presence of a man she had just met, but her body had other ideas. "Rest," Matthew said gently. "You have been through an ordeal. I will keep the fire going." "We should not stay here," Beatrice murmured, already half asleep. "My father will worry." "The sun is already setting," Matthew pointed out, "and your clothes are still wet. We will head back to town at first light, I promise. For now, you need to rest and get your strength back." It made sense, but Beatrice still felt a flutter of anxiety. Spending the night alone with a man, even one who had saved her life, would cause a scandal if anyone found out. But what choice did they have? She could not ride back to town in wet clothes with night falling. She would freeze to death before they made it halfway. "Thank you," she whispered, letting her eyes close, "for saving my life." "You are welcome," Matthew said, and those were the last words she heard before sleep claimed her. When Beatrice woke, early morning light was filtering through the cabin's single window. She was covered with an extra blanket that had not been there when she fell asleep, and the fire was still burning steadily. Matthew was sitting at the small table by the window, working on a piece of leather tack with a needle and thread. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes, and Beatrice realized with a start that he had probably stayed awake all night to tend the fire. "Good morning," she said, her voice rough with sleep. Matthew looked up and something in his expression softened. "Good morning. How do you feel?" Beatrice took inventory of her body. She was sore and stiff and her throat hurt, but the bone-deep cold was gone. "Better," she said. "Alive." "That is a good start," Matthew said with a small smile. He set down the tack and moved to the stove. "I have some jerky and hardtack if you are hungry. Not fancy, but it will do." Beatrice's stomach rumbled in response, and they both laughed. She accepted the simple breakfast gratefully, surprised by how hungry she was. As she ate, Matthew checked on her clothes. Most were dry or close to it, warmed by their night near the fire. "I will step outside while you dress," he said. "Take your time." We have a few hours' ride to town, and I want to make sure you are steady before we leave." Once he was gone, Beatrice dressed quickly in her dry clothes. Everything smelled of wood smoke now, but it was better than the alternative. She finger-combed her hair as best she could and tried to make herself presentable, though she suspected she still looked like someone who had nearly drowned the day before. When she opened the door, Matthew was saddling his horse, his breath misting in the cold morning air. "Ready?" he asked. Beatrice nodded. Matthew helped her mount, then swung up behind her as he had the night before. His arms came around her to grip the reins, and Beatrice felt that same flutter of awareness she had experienced yesterday. This close, she could smell leather and soap and something uniquely him. It was not unpleasant. The ride to Deer Lodge took longer than Matthew had estimated because he kept the horse to a walk, not wanting to jostle Beatrice too much. They talked as they rode, sharing small pieces of their lives. Matthew told her about growing up in Ohio, about losing his parents to fever within a week of each other, about the long journey west to start over. Beatrice spoke of growing up in Deer Lodge, of helping her father run the store after her mother died 3 years ago, of the quiet rhythm of small-town life. "You ever want to leave?" Matthew asked. "See more of the world, sometimes," Beatrice admitted, "but my father needs me." "And it is home. What about you? Do you think you will stay at the CCC forever?" Matthew was quiet for a moment. "I have been saving money," he said finally. "Hoping to buy my own place someday. Nothing big, just enough land for a small herd and a house, a place of my own." There was something wistful in his voice that made Beatrice's heart ache. She understood that desire for something more, something that was truly yours. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence, born of shared understanding. As they crested the final hill, Deer Lodge came into view below them. It was a small town, just a cluster of buildings along the main road, but it had everything essential, including her father's store. Matthew guided the horse down the slope and onto the main street. It was still early enough that few people were out, for which Beatrice was grateful. She could only imagine the gossip that would spread if they were seen riding into town together. Matthew stopped the horse in the alley behind the general store. Beatrice's father lived in the rooms above the shop, and she could see a lamp burning in the window. He was awake then and probably worried sick. "Thank you," Beatrice said as Matthew helped her dismount, "for everything. You saved my life." "I am glad I was there," Matthew said simply. They stood there for a moment, facing each other in the cold morning air. Beatrice felt like she should say something more, something to acknowledge the strange intimacy of the night they had shared, but words failed her. Matthew seemed to be struggling with the same thing. Finally, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was part farewell, part respect. "Take care of yourself, Miss Turner," he said. "Beatrice," she corrected. "After everything, I think you can call me Beatrice." A smile ghosted across his face. "Beatrice, then, take care." He mounted his horse and rode away without looking back. Beatrice watched until he disappeared around the corner, then turned and climbed the stairs to her father's door. She had barely knocked when it flew open and her father pulled her into a crushing embrace. "Where have you been?" Thomas Turner demanded, his voice rough with emotion. "I have been out of my mind with worry. You left yesterday afternoon and never came home. I was about to organize a search party." "I am sorry, Papa," Beatrice said, hugging him back. "I had an accident." She told him the story as he led her inside and settled her in a chair by the stove. His face went pale when she described falling through the ice, then flushed with anger when he realized how close he had come to losing her. But when she spoke of Matthew Carter diving in to save her, spending the night in the line shack because it was too dangerous to travel, her father's expression softened. "This young man," he said slowly. "He stayed awake all night to keep the fire going. He gave you his coat and his blankets." "Yes," Beatrice said. "He was a perfect gentleman, Papa. He saved my life." Thomas Turner was quiet for a long moment. "Then I owe him a debt I can never repay," he said finally. "A man's daughter is his most precious treasure. This Matthew Carter gave me back mine." Over the following days, Beatrice found herself thinking about Matthew far more than she should. She replayed their conversations in her mind, remembering the way he had looked at her by firelight, the gentleness in his strong hands. She told herself she was being foolish. They had spent barely 24 hours together, most of it in circumstances of survival and necessity. It did not mean anything, but her heart disagreed with her head. A week after the incident, Beatrice was working in the store when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up from the ledger she was updating and felt her breath catch. Matthew Carter stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking somehow both confident and uncertain at the same time. "Miss Turner," he said, then corrected himself with a slight smile. "Beatrice." "Matthew," she said, pleased that her voice came out steady despite the sudden racing of her heart. "What brings you to town?" "I had some business to attend to," he said, moving closer to the counter. "But I also wanted to check on you, make sure you were recovering well." "I am perfectly fine," Beatrice assured him. "Thanks to you." "Good," Matthew said. He seemed to be working up the courage to say something else. Beatrice waited, her hands folded on the counter to keep them from trembling. "I was wondering," he finally continued, "if you might allow me to call on you, properly I mean. With your father's permission, of course." Joy bloomed in Beatrice's chest, but she kept her expression calm. "I would like that very much," she said. "You would?" Matthew's face lit up in a way that made him look years younger. "I mean, that is good. That is very good." Beatrice could not help but smile at his sudden awkwardness. This was a man who had fearlessly jumped into a frozen river to save a stranger, but asking permission to court made him nervous. She found it endearing. "My father is upstairs," she said. "Would you like to speak with him now?" Matthew straightened his shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. "Yes," he said. "No time like the present." Thomas Turner proved easier to convince than either of them had expected. He came downstairs, listened to Matthew's formal request to court his daughter, and studied the young cowboy for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. "Any man brave enough to jump into the Yellowstone in January is brave enough to court my daughter," he said. "But I will expect you to treat her with the respect she deserves." "You have my word, sir," Matthew said, shaking his hand firmly. "I will treasure her as the gift she is." And so it began. Matthew came to town every Sunday, his one day off from the ranch. He and Beatrice would take walks along the safer paths away from the river, or sit in the parlor above the store and talk for hours. Thomas Turner proved a lenient chaperone, often finding reasons to be busy in the store below and leaving them alone for stretches of time that would have scandalized the more proper families in town. As winter gave way to early spring, Beatrice found herself falling deeper in love with Matthew Carter. He was unlike anyone she had ever known. He spoke to her as an equal, asking her opinions on everything from politics to poetry. He made her laugh with stories of life on the ranch, the ornery cattle and stubborn horses, and the colorful characters he worked alongside. But he also listened when she talked about her dreams of maybe opening a lending library in town, or her frustration with the limited options available to women who wanted to do more than marry and keep house. "You should do it," he said one afternoon in April as they walked through the greening hills outside town. "Start your library. I think it is a fine idea." "My father says the same thing," Beatrice said, "but where would I get the books, and who would come?" "Most people in Deer Lodge are too busy working to read for pleasure." "Then you will educate them about the importance of reading," Matthew said simply. Show them what they are missing. You are smart and passionate, Beatrice. If anyone can make it work, you can. She stopped walking and turned to face him. You really believe that? I do, Matthew said seriously. I have believed in you since the moment I pulled you out of that river and saw the fight in your eyes. You are a survivor, Beatrice Turner. You are strong and brave and capable of anything you set your mind to. Tears pricked at Beatrice's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such absolute confidence in her abilities. On impulse, she reached up and kissed his cheek. Matthew froze, then slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes were dark and intense, and Beatrice felt heat flood through her that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. Beatrice, he said, his voice rough. May I kiss you? Properly, I mean. In answer, she lifted her face to his. Matthew cupped her cheek with one calloused hand and bent to press his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but when Beatrice leaned into him it deepened. His arms came around her waist, pulling her close, and Beatrice felt like she was drowning again, but this time in warmth instead of cold, in feeling instead of fear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said quietly. I think I have loved you since I saw you fighting your way to the surface of that river, refusing to give up. I know it is too soon to say such things, but I cannot help it. I love you, Beatrice. It is not too soon, Beatrice whispered, because I love you too. I have been trying not to, telling myself it was gratitude or something else, but it is not. It is love. They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally started walking back to town, their hands were intertwined and their hearts were bound together in a way that felt as natural as breathing. But love, Beatrice soon learned, was not always simple. In late May, Matthew came to town on a Wednesday instead of his usual Sunday visit. Beatrice knew immediately that something was wrong from the tension in his shoulders and the grim set of his mouth. What is it? She asked, leading him upstairs away from the customers in the store. Matthew sat heavily in one of the parlor chairs. The Triple C is in trouble, he said. The owner died last month, and his son back east is selling the ranch to pay off debts. All of us hands have until the end of June to find new positions. Beatrice felt her stomach drop. Where will you go? I do not know yet, Matthew admitted. There is work at some of the other ranches around here, but nothing permanent. Most of the foremen I have talked to can only offer seasonal work. He looked up at her, misery plain in his eyes. I might have to move on, Beatrice. Head further west to Wyoming or Colorado, where they are still hiring for the summer drives. No, Beatrice said sharply. You cannot leave. I do not want to, Matthew said. God knows I do not want to, but I need work, Beatrice. I have been saving money, but not enough to buy land yet. I need steady employment to keep building my stake. They sat in heavy silence, both of them thinking through impossible options. Finally, Beatrice spoke. How much do you have saved? She asked. Matthew looked surprised by the question. About $800, he said. Why? And how much would you need to buy a small piece of land? Enough for what you talked about that day, a small herd and a house. Depends on the land, Matthew said slowly. But probably another 1,000 at minimum. Why are you asking this? Beatrice stood and paced to the window, her mind racing. My mother left me money, she said, in a trust that I can access when I turn 21 or when I marry, whichever comes first. It is $1,500. Beatrice, Matthew said warningly. Listen to me, she said, turning to face him. What if we got married? We could combine our money and buy that land you want. You could raise cattle and horses, and I could start my library. We could build something together. Matthew stood, crossing to her in 2 long strides. I will not have you marry me for money, he said firmly. That is not how this works. I am not marrying you for money, Beatrice said, taking his hands. I am marrying you because I love you, because I want to spend my life with you. The money just solves a practical problem. She squeezed his fingers. Or are you going to tell me you do not want to marry me? You know that is not true, Matthew said, but there was anguish in his voice. I have thought about asking you to marry me every single day since April, but I wanted to do it right. I wanted to have something to offer you first, a home and security. I will not be a husband who lives off his wife's inheritance. You will not be, Beatrice insisted. You have $800 of your own. We would be equal partners in this, Matthew, building our future together. She studied his face, reading the conflict there. Unless you do not want to be tied to Deer Lodge, if your dream is to keep moving west to see more of the frontier, I will understand. My dream is you, Matthew said quietly. It has been you since the moment I pulled you out of that river. Everything else is just details. Then marry me, Beatrice said. Marry me and let's build our dream together. Matthew pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Yes, he said against her hair. Yes, I will marry you, but we do this as equal partners in everything, agreed. I will not have you think I married you for your money. I would never think that, Beatrice said, pulling back to look at him. I know your heart, Matthew Carter. It is one of the reasons I love you. They went downstairs to tell Thomas Turner, who took the news with surprising calm. He looked between the two of them, young and in love and determined to make their own way, and sighed. I knew this was coming, he said. The way you two look at each other, it was only a matter of time. He fixed Matthew with a stern look. You will be good to her. You will make her happy. I will spend every day trying, Matthew promised. Then you have my blessing, Thomas said. He pulled Beatrice into a hug. Your mother would have liked him, he whispered. She always did have a soft spot for honest, hard-working men. They were married in early June in a simple ceremony at the small church in Deer Lodge. Beatrice wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried wildflowers that Matthew had picked himself. The guest list was small, just a handful of townspeople and some of Matthew's former co-workers from the Triple C. But the love in that little church was immense, a palpable thing that seemed to fill every corner. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed Beatrice with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Beatrice felt like her heart might burst from happiness. This was what she had been waiting for her whole life without even knowing it. This moment, this man, this beginning. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With their combined savings, they purchased 40 acres of good grazing land about 5 miles from town. It came with a small creek for water and a half-finished cabin that the previous owner had abandoned. Matthew threw himself into completing the cabin, working from dawn to dusk to make it livable. Beatrice helped where she could, learning to handle a hammer and saw, her hands developing calluses to match his. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of their slowly growing home and watch the sun set over the mountains. Matthew would tell her his plans for the ranch, where he would build the barn, how he would manage the herd. Beatrice would share her ideas for the library, how she would acquire books, what kind of reading programs she might offer. They dreamed together, planned together, and when the stars came out, they would retreat inside to the narrow bed and explore the physical side of their love with growing confidence and joy. By late July, the cabin was finished and they moved in properly. It was small and rough compared to the comfortable rooms above her father's store, but it was theirs. Beatrice had never been happier. She woke each morning to Matthew's arms around her and fell asleep each night to his steady breathing beside her. They worked side by side during the day, building corrals and clearing land, and in the quiet moments they talked about everything and nothing. learning each other's minds as thoroughly as they had learned each other's bodies. In August, Matthew bought their first cattle, 10 head from a rancher who was downsizing. It was not much, but it was a start. He worked those cattle with a dedication that awed Beatrice, checking them multiple times a day, making sure they had good grass and clean water. She could see his pride in those animals, the way he looked at them and saw the future they represented. Meanwhile, Beatrice began the hard work of establishing her library. She wrote to publishing houses back east, explaining her project and asking for donations of books. To her surprise and delight, several responded positively. By September, crates of books began arriving on the stage. She set up shop in one of the empty buildings on Deer Lodge's Main Street, a space her father helped her rent for a pittance. She spent weeks organizing the books, creating a simple lending system, spreading word about what she was trying to do. The library opened in October, and Beatrice spent the first day worried that no one would come. But by noon, a steady trickle of people had begun to arrive. Ranch hands looking for something to read during the winter, children sent by their mothers to check out the new place, even a few of the town's more educated residents curious about what Beatrice had created. By closing time, she had checked out 15 books and signed up 20 people for borrowing cards. It was a small success, but it felt monumental. When she got home that night, exhausted but elated, Matthew swept her into his arms and spun her around. "I knew you could do it," he said, kissing her soundly. "I am so proud of you. We did it," Beatrice corrected. "None of this would have been possible without you, without us being partners." Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. The winter of 1886 was harsh, one of the worst Montana had seen in years. They lost 2 of their cattle to the cold, and there were nights when Matthew came home so exhausted from breaking ice on the creek and hauling feed that he could barely stand. The library had to close for 2 weeks in January when snow made the roads impassable. Money was tight, every dollar carefully counted and allocated, but they had each other, and that made all the difference. On the coldest nights, they would huddle together under every blanket they owned and talk about the spring, about all the things they would do when the weather broke. Matthew taught Beatrice to play poker using dried beans as stakes, and she taught him to read poetry, introducing him to Whitman and Longfellow. They laughed together, loved together, and survived together. When spring finally came, it felt like a resurrection. The snow melted, the grass turned green, and their remaining cattle came through the winter healthy and strong. Better still, 3 of the cows were pregnant, promising new life and new hope for their growing herd. The library reopened to an enthusiastic reception, with several new members signing up immediately. In late April, Beatrice realized she had missed her monthly courses twice in a row. She said nothing at first, not wanting to get Matthew's hopes up until she was certain. But when a 3rd month passed and she began experiencing morning sickness, she could no longer deny the truth. She was pregnant. She told Matthew on a Sunday afternoon in May, exactly 1 year from the day he had kissed her for the first time. They were sitting on their porch, watching the cattle graze in the distance, and Beatrice simply took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby," she said softly. Matthew's eyes went wide. For a moment he seemed frozen, unable to process the words. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming him. He let out a whoop of joy loud enough to startle the cattle and pulled Beatrice into his arms, holding her like she was made of glass. "A baby," he breathed. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Beatrice asked, though she could see the answer written all over his face. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Matthew said. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You have given me everything, Beatrice. A home, a future, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." Beatrice laughed, joy bubbling up inside her like champagne. "We are both lucky," she said, "to have found each other, to have this life we have built. To have survived that frozen river," Matthew added with a grin. "Yes," Beatrice agreed, "to have survived." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Beatrice continued to run the library, though she trained one of the town girls to help as her energy began to wane. Matthew became even more protective than usual, insisting she not lift anything heavy or work too hard. It would have been annoying if it was not so endearing. He built a cradle with his own hands, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, and Beatrice sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small a newborn must be to fit them. In December, as the first snows began to fall, Beatrice went into labor. Her father rode out to get the midwife while Matthew stayed by her side, holding her hand and whispering encouragement as the contractions intensified. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day, and there were moments when Beatrice thought she could not go on. But Matthew never left her side, and when she looked into his eyes, she found the strength to keep going. Their son was born just as the sun was setting on a cold December evening. He came into the world screaming lustily, his tiny face red with indignation. The midwife cleaned him up and placed him in Beatrice's arms, and she looked down at the miracle they had created. He had Matthew's dark hair and her blue eyes, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Welcome to the world." Matthew sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Beatrice and one finger caught in their son's tiny fist. There were tears on his cheeks, unashamed and open. "What should we name him?" he asked. They had discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at her husband's face soft with love and wonder, Beatrice knew exactly what to call their son. "James," she said. "James Thomas Carter, after my father and yours." Matthew nodded, too overcome to speak. He leaned down and kissed his son's forehead, then Beatrice's lips. "James," he repeated. "It is perfect." The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and infant care. James proved to be a healthy, hungry baby who demanded attention at all hours. Beatrice had never been so tired in her life, but she had also never been so happy. Watching Matthew with their son, seeing the tenderness with which he held the tiny body, the gentleness of his touch, made her fall in love with him all over again. Spring came again, their third in Montana, and with it new blessings. The cattle herd had grown to 20 head, and Matthew hired a young hand to help with the work so he could spend more time with his family. The library was thriving, with Beatrice training 2 assistants who allowed her to reduce her hours. She brought James to work with her when he was small, keeping him in a basket by her desk, and the townspeople doted on him shamelessly. As the years passed, their life together deepened and grew richer. In 1889, Beatrice gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, who had her father's brown eyes and a fierce determination from birth. 2 years later came another son, William, who was gentle and thoughtful like his mother. The cabin grew with their family, Matthew adding rooms as they were needed until it was a proper house. The ranch prospered too. By 1892, they had 40 head of cattle and a reputation for quality stock. Matthew proved to have a gift for breeding and training horses as well, and soon their horses were sought after by ranchers throughout the territory. They were not rich, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. The library became a cornerstone of the community. Beatrice eventually moved it to a larger building and expanded the collection to include not just fiction but practical books on farming, animal husbandry, and homemaking. She started a program where ranch wives could meet once a month to discuss books and share knowledge, creating a network of support that helped many women through the isolation of frontier life. In 1894, when James was 7 years old, he asked his mother to tell him again the story of how his parents met. They were sitting on the porch, watching his father work with a young horse in the corral, and Beatrice smiled at the question she had answered 100 times before. "Your father saved my life," she began, as she always did. "I fell through the ice of the Yellowstone River and he jumped in to pull me out." "Was he scared?" James asked. Beatrice considered the question. "I think he must have been," she said. "It was very dangerous. But he did it anyway, because that is the kind of man your father is. He does what is right even when it is hard or frightening." "I want to be like him when I grow up," James said seriously. "You are already like him," Beatrice said, ruffling his dark hair. "You have his courage and his good heart." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Matthew coax the young horse into accepting a saddle. He had patience with animals that amazed Beatrice, the same patience he showed with their children. He never raised his voice or his hand, instead using calm consistency to teach and guide. Their children adored him, following him around the ranch like a trio of devoted ducklings whenever they could. That evening, after the children were asleep, Beatrice and Matthew sat together on the porch as they had so many times before. It was June, warm and pleasant, with fireflies dancing in the darkness. Matthew's arm was around her shoulders, and Beatrice leaned into his solid warmth with a contentment that went bone deep. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked. "When you pulled me out of the river?" "Sometimes," Matthew admitted. "Usually when I look at you and think about how close I came to never knowing you, never having this life." He tightened his arm around her. "It terrifies me, even now, the thought of a world where I did not jump in, where I let you drown." "But you did jump in," Beatrice said. "You saved me, and everything good in my life came from that moment." "Everything good in my life too," Matthew said. He turned to look at her in the moonlight. "I love you, Beatrice. I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you until the end." "I love you too," Beatrice whispered. "Always and forever." They kissed, a soft press of lips that held years of shared history and boundless future. When they pulled apart, they sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch they had built together. In the distance, the cattle lowed softly. Closer by, their horses shuffled in the barn. Inside the house, their 3 children slept peacefully in their beds, safe and loved and protected. This was everything they had dreamed of that first spring when they were newly married and full of hope. They had taken a chance on each other, on love, on a life that was uncertain and difficult, and they had won. They had built something real and lasting, a family and a home and a legacy that would endure. Years continued to pass in their steady, reliable way. The children grew, each developing their own distinct personalities and dreams. James proved to have his father's gift with animals and his mother's love of learning, devouring every book in the library while also working the ranch with dedication. Sarah was fierce and independent, announcing at age 12 that she intended to be a doctor someday, and neither parent doubted she would find a way. William was the quietest of the 3, but his gentle nature hid a brilliant mind for mathematics and engineering. In 1898, when Montana achieved statehood and the frontier was slowly becoming civilized, Beatrice and Matthew celebrated their 12th anniversary. They left the children with Beatrice's father, now in his 70s but still spry, and spent 2 days alone at the cabin where Matthew had taken her after pulling her from the river. The line shack had long since been abandoned, but the Triple Seaticus new owners allowed them to use it for their private celebration. "It is smaller than I remembered," Beatrice said with a laugh as they stepped inside. The single room seemed tiny compared to their sprawling house, the fireplace almost quaint. "We were smaller then too," Matthew said, pulling her close. "Younger, less sure of ourselves." "Were we?" Beatrice asked. "I remember feeling very sure even then. Sure that I wanted you, sure that we could make it work." "You were always the brave one," Matthew said. "I was terrified I would fail you." "You have never failed me," Beatrice said seriously. "Not once in 12 years. They spent those 2 days remembering their beginning, walking the paths they had walked when they were courting, talking for hours the way they had when every conversation was a revelation. They made love in the narrow bunk where Beatrice had slept that first night, finding it absurdly cramped, but not caring. On the second evening they sat by the fireplace, and Matthew pulled out a small wooden box. "I have been saving this for the right moment," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant. The pendant was shaped like a snowflake, intricate and beautiful. "Matthew," Beatrice breathed, "it is gorgeous." "It is to remember that frozen river," Matthew said. "The ice that nearly took you from me, but instead brought us together." He fastened it around her neck, his fingers gentle on her skin. "Everything good in my life started with ice and water and you refusing to give up. I wanted you to have something to commemorate that." Beatrice touched the pendant, feeling tears sting her eyes. "I will treasure it always," she said, "as I treasure you." They returned home refreshed and reconnected, ready to face the new challenges that came with the turn of the century. The ranch continued to grow, now employing 3 full-time hands in addition to Matthew and James, who was old enough at 15 to do a man's work. The library had expanded again, now offering regular classes in reading and basic education for adults who had never had the opportunity to learn. In 1902, Sarah left for medical school in the East, the first woman from Deer Lodge to pursue such a path. The whole town turned out to see her off on the stage, and Matthew held Beatrice as she cried proud tears. William followed 2 years later, heading to a technical college in California to study civil engineering. Only James remained, taking over more and more of the ranch work as Matthew began to slow down, the years of hard physical labor catching up with him. "I never thought I would be one of those men who sits on the porch while the young ones do the work," Matthew said ruefully one afternoon in 1905. He was 50 years old now, his dark hair liberally streaked with silver, but still handsome in Beatrice's eyes. "You have earned the right to rest," Beatrice said. She was 45 herself, her own hair showing threads of gray, but she still ran the library 3 days a week and kept their home running smoothly. "You built this ranch from nothing. Let James take it forward." "He is doing a fine job," Matthew agreed. "Better than I did at his age." "He learned from the best," Beatrice said, kissing his cheek. In 1907, James married a girl from town named Emily, and they moved into a house built on the far corner of the ranch property. 2 years later, Beatrice and Matthew became grandparents when Emily gave birth to a daughter. Holding that tiny baby, seeing her son's face transformed by the same wonder and love she remembered from when James was born, Beatrice felt the circle of life completing itself in the most beautiful way. Sarah returned home in 1910, newly graduated and ready to set up practice in Deer Lodge. She was 28, confident and competent, and the town embraced her despite their initial skepticism about a woman doctor. William visited when he could, bringing stories of bridges he was helping to build and cities he had seen. The family gathered for holidays and special occasions, filling the house with noise and laughter and love. In 1915, Beatrice and Matthew celebrated their 29th anniversary quietly, just the two of them on their porch watching the sunset. The ranch was thriving under James's management, with nearly 100 head of cattle now. The library had become a permanent institution in Deer Lodge, with 2 full-time librarians and plans to build a proper brick building. Their children were all settled and successful in their own ways. It was more than they had ever dreamed possible that day when Matthew had jumped into a frozen river to save a drowning woman. "You have any regrets?" Beatrice asked, her hand in his. Matthew thought about it for a long moment. "Not a single one," he said finally. "Every choice I made led me here to this life with you. How could I regret any of that?" "I feel the same way," Beatrice said. "Even falling through the ice, even nearly drowning, because it brought me to you." "We saved each other," Matthew said. "I pulled you out of the water, but you saved me from a life of loneliness and wandering. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose." "We gave those things to each other," Beatrice corrected gently. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to deep purple. Stars began to emerge, the same stars that had watched over them for nearly 30 years. Inside the house, everything was quiet and settled. Outside, their land stretched away in all directions, 40 acres that represented the foundation of everything they had built. "Thank you," Matthew said suddenly. "For what?" Beatrice asked. "For saying yes when I asked to court you, for marrying me when we barely knew each other, for believing we could build this life together." He squeezed her hand. "For being brave enough to fall in love with a cowboy who had nothing but dreams and determination." "You had more than that," Beatrice said. "You had honor and courage and the biggest heart I have ever known. How could I not fall in love with you?" Matthew pulled her close, and they sat wrapped in each other's arms as night fell completely. They had weathered so much together over the years, hard winters and harder losses, the constant challenges of frontier life. But they had also experienced immeasurable joy, watching their children grow, building something lasting from nothing, loving each other more with each passing year. The years continued their steady march. Matthew's health began to decline as he entered his 60s, his joints stiffening with arthritis, his breath growing shorter. Beatrice nursed him through each setback with the same determination she had shown in everything else, refusing to let him give up. They adapted, finding new ways to be together as his mobility decreased. He could no longer work the ranch, but he could sit on the porch and watch James and his crew. He could still hold Beatrice at night, still make her laugh with his dry observations about life. In 1920, they celebrated their 30th anniversary surrounded by family. James and Emily had given them 3 grandchildren now. Sarah, who had married a lawyer from Helena, had 2 children of her own. William had brought his wife and young son from California. The house overflowed with love and laughter. 3 generations gathered to honor the couple who had started it all. Looking around the crowded dining room, seeing the faces of her children and grandchildren, Beatrice felt overwhelming gratitude. All of this, every person in this room, existed because a cowboy had been brave enough to jump into a frozen river 34 years ago. Because 2 people had chosen to trust in love even when the future was uncertain. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked quietly. He was seated at the head of the table, thinner than he used to be, but still possessing that quiet strength she had always loved. "That we were right to take the chance," Beatrice said. "That every hard moment was worth it to get here." "Every single one," Matthew agreed. They lived 5 more good years together. Matthew's health continued to fail slowly, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Beatrice never wavered. She cared for him with tender devotion, and he accepted her care with gratitude rather than resentment. They had always been partners, and that did not change even as the balance of their relationship shifted. On a cold January morning in 1926, 40 years almost to the day after he had pulled Beatrice from the Yellowstone River, Matthew Carter died peacefully in his sleep. Beatrice woke to find him gone, his hand still clasped in hers, his face peaceful. The grief was immense, a crushing weight that threatened to drown her as surely as that frozen river had, but she was a survivor, as Matthew had always said. She mourned him deeply, missing him with an ache that never fully went away, but she did not let the grief consume her. She had their children and grandchildren, the ranch they had built, the library she had founded. She had 4 decades of memories, of love and laughter and shared dreams made real. Matthew had given her all of that, and she honored his memory by continuing to live fully. Beatrice lived another 15 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1941 at the age of 81. She was surrounded by family to the end, 3 generations who owed their existence to a moment of courage on a frozen winter day. Her children buried her next to Matthew on a hill overlooking the ranch, where they could watch over the land they had built together for eternity. The ranch remained in the Carter family for generations, each successive owner hearing the story of how it all began. The library in Deer Lodge thrived and grew, eventually being renamed the Turner Memorial Library in Beatrice's honor. And on cold January days when the Yellowstone River froze over, people in Deer Lodge would remember the story of the woman who nearly drowned and the cowboy who saved her, and how that single moment of bravery had created a legacy of love that lasted long after both of them were gone. Because that was the truth of Beatrice and Matthew's story. It was not just about surviving a frozen river or building a ranch or starting a library. It was about 2 people who chose each other against the odds, who built a life together through determination and love, who created something lasting from a single moment of courage. It was about partnership and devotion, about facing life's challenges together and never giving up on each other. It was a love story in the truest sense, one that transcended time and circumstance to become something eternal. And it all started with ice and water and a cowboy brave enough to dive in, and a woman strong enough to keep fighting until she was saved. Together, they had built something beautiful, something that endured long after the details of their daily lives had faded into history. They had loved deeply and completely, and in doing so, they had created a legacy that would never be forgotten. Their great-grandchildren still told the story, passing it down to their own children and grandchildren. The cabin where Matthew had taken Beatrice that first night still stood, preserved by the family as a monument to their beginning. And every winter, when the first ice formed on the Yellowstone River, someone in the Carter family would stand on the bank and remember the courage it took to jump into freezing water, and the strength it took to survive it. They would remember that love sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, in the most dangerous moments, and that when you find it, you hold on with everything you have. That was the lesson Beatrice and Matthew had taught through their lives together. Love was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth building a life around. And when you found someone willing to jump into a frozen river to save you, someone who would stand by your side through every challenge life could throw at you, you held on to them and never let go. Beatrice and Matthew had done exactly that. They had held onto each other through 4 decades of marriage, through joy and sorrow, prosperity and hardship, youth and old age. They had built a family, a ranch, a library, and a legacy. But more than any of those tangible things, they had built a love that transcended their individual lives to become something greater, something that inspired everyone who heard their story. And it all started on a frozen river in January, with a woman drowning and a cowboy brave enough to dive in after her. Everything else, All the years of love and partnership and shared dreams grew from that single moment of courage. It was a reminder that life could change in an instant, that heroism came in many forms, and that love, when you found it, was worth any risk. The story of Beatrice Turner and Matthew Carter became a legend in Deer Lodge and the surrounding territory, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. But for those who had known them, who had seen the way they looked at each other even after decades of marriage, who had witnessed the partnership they had built, it was no myth. It was simply the truth of two people who had loved each other completely, who had taken a chance on building a life together, and who had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Their love had been tested by frozen rivers and harsh winters, by financial hardship and the constant challenges of frontier life. But it had never broken, never wavered, never faltered. Instead, it had grown stronger with each passing year, deepening into something profound and unshakable. They had saved each other in every way that mattered, and in doing so, they had created something beautiful. And so the story ended where it began, with ice and water and courage and love. With a woman who refused to give up and a man who refused to let her drown. With two people who found each other against all odds and built a life that mattered, a love that lasted, a legacy that endured. That was the story of Beatrice and Matthew, the woman and the cowboy, the frozen river and the life that came after. It was a story of survival and courage, of partnership and devotion, of building something lasting from a single moment of bravery. But most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple, the kind that reminded people why love was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth building an entire life around. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Not the hardships they had faced or the challenges they had overcome, but the fact that they had faced them together, with love as their foundation and partnership as their strength. They had jumped into the frozen waters of life together, and they had emerged triumphant, hand in hand, ready to build a future that would outlast them both. That was their legacy, their gift to all who came after them. The knowledge that love, when you found it, was worth everything. That courage came in many forms, from jumping into frozen rivers to saying yes to uncertain futures. That two people, working together with determination and devotion, could build something that would last for generations. The frozen river had tried to take Beatrice Turner that January day in 1886. But Matthew Carter had refused to let it, and in saving her life, he had found his own. Together, they had built a love story for the ages, one that would be remembered long after the ice had melted and the rivers had run dry. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy of all.